Imagine being at 23,000 feet altitude, inside a completely destroyed B-17 bomber. The nose of the aircraft was ripped off by an anti-aircraft shell. Freezing wind at minus 40 degrees invades a cabin at over 180 miles per hour. Two of your engines are on fire. The hydraulic system is destroyed. The landing gear is jammed. Half of your crew is wounded or dead, and you're still hundreds of miles over enemy territory, surrounded by Nazi fighters hungry for blood. Any sensible pilot would abandon the aircraft. Any war manual would say to bail out with a parachute. Any logical calculation would indicate that plane would never make it home. But Lieutenant Alan McGee wasn't just any pilot. And what happened in the next few hours would defy all laws of physics, probability, and human survival itself. This is a story of men who refused to die, of pilots who transformed flying coffins into miracles of improvised engineering, of crews who completed impossible missions with aircraft that, technically, shouldn't even be in the air. Welcome to the most intense episode of this channel. Today, we're going to dive into the real stories of suicide missions completed with crippled aircraft. Stories so absurd that if they were fiction, nobody would believe them. To understand the magnitude of these stories, we first need to understand the hell that was flying over Nazi-occupied Europe during World War II. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States 8th Air Force conducted one of the deadliest bombing campaigns in military history. The strategy was simple on paper. Heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, would fly in massive formations over Germany, destroying factories, oil refineries, railways, and Nazi military infrastructure. In practice, it was a massacre. American bombers flew during the day, unlike the British, who preferred the cover of night. The logic was that daytime bombing would be more accurate. The problem? This also meant the Germans could see exactly where the planes were, and the Germans were prepared. The Luftwaffe, the Nazi Air Force, developed an absolutely lethal air defense network. Thousands of anti-aircraft guns, the dreaded flak, formed curtains of fire over strategic targets. Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 fighters, piloted by veteran aces, intercepted bomber formations with deadly precision. The numbers are terrifying. The 8th Air Force lost more than 26,000 aircraft during the war. More than 47,000 crew members were killed in combat. Another 23,000 were captured as prisoners of war. The casualty rate was so high that, statistically, completing 25 missions, the number needed to go home, was almost impossible. To put it in perspective, on some missions, the loss rate reached 30%. That means out of every 10 aircraft that took off, 3 didn't come back, and those that did return frequently brought wounded, dead, and catastrophic damage. It was in this apocalyptic scenario that young men of 19, 20, 21 years old climbed into aluminum bombers and prayed to survive another day. Before we continue, I need to talk about the machine that stars in most of these stories, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The B-17 was a colossus with a 104-foot wingspan, for Wright-R 1820 radial engines, capacity to carry more than 4,000 pounds of bombs, and a crew of 10 men. It earned the nickname Flying Fortress because of its defensive armament. Up to 1350 caliber machine guns positioned in rotating turrets, on the sides, in the nose, in the tail, and in the belly of the aircraft. But what really made the B-17 legendary wasn't its firepower. It was its absurd ability to absorb damage and keep flying. Boeing engineers designed the aircraft with structural redundancies that seemed excessive at the time. Reinforced spars, duplicated systems, self-sealing fuel tanks. In theory, it was overkill. In practice, it saved thousands of lives. There are photographs of B-17s that returned to base with half a wing torn off, with the tail hanging by a few cables, with holes the size of cars in the fuselage, with engines completely destroyed. Aircraft that, by all laws of aerodynamics, should have fallen from the sky like stones. But they didn't fall, and this is where our story really begins. January 3rd, 1943. A formation of B-17s from the 303rd Bombardment Group takes off from England heading to Saint-Nazaire in occupied France. The target, the German submarine bunkers, massive concrete structures that protected the dreaded Nazi U-boats. Sergeant Alan McGee, 24 years old, was the ball turret gunner of the B-17, nicknamed Snap, Crackle Pop, yes, like the cereal. His position was one of the most vulnerable on the aircraft, a glass and metal bubble hanging from the belly of the bomber, exposed to attacks from all angles. The mission started bad and got worse quickly when the formation approached the target. The sky exploded in anti-aircraft fire. The Germans had concentrated an absurd amount of flak batteries around St. Nazaire, transforming the airspace into a wall of shrapnel and explosions. Snap, Crackle, Pop was hit repeatedly. A shell exploded near engine number 3, setting it on fire. Another destroyed part of the oxygen system. A third went through the fuselage, wounding several crew members. But the worst was yet to come. An FW-190 fighter dove over the formation and concentrated fire on McGee's ball turret. The shots destroyed the turret's rotation mechanism, jamming it in position. McGee was trapped, unable to defend himself or escape. Then another anti-aircraft shell hit the aircraft directly. The explosion was catastrophic. The B-17 began to spin uncontrollably, entering a spiral. The pilot lost control. The order to abandon the aircraft was given. McGee managed, with superhuman effort, to free himself from the destroyed turret and crawl inside the fuselage. But when he looked for his parachute, he discovered the horror. It had been destroyed by shrapnel, torn, unusable. He was at 22,000 feet altitude in a burning aircraft, spinning toward the ground without a parachute. What happened next defies any rational explanation. McGee was ejected from the aircraft, or jumped, accounts vary, and began to fall, without a parachute. Almost 4 miles of free fall. He should have died. The terminal velocity of a human body in free fall is approximately 120 miles per hour. Impact with the ground at that speed is invariably fatal. But McGee didn't hit the ground. He crashed through the glass roof of the St. Nazaire train station. The glass, an ornamental structure from the 19th century, absorbed part of the impact. McGee fell onto the debris unconscious, with multiple fractures, but alive. The Germans who found him couldn't believe what they were seeing. An American airman, fallen from the sky without a parachute, breathing. They took him to a hospital, where German doctors treat his injuries. Broken arm, broken ankle, kidney damage, severe shrapnel wounds. Alan McGee survived. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, was liberated in 1945, and lived 84 years old, passing away in 2003. His fall from 22,000 feet without a parachute remains one of the most documented cases of free fall survival in history. If Alan McGee's story is about individual survival against all odds, the story of the B-17 All-American is about a machine that refused to die. February 1st, 1943, the All-American, piloted by Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, was participating in a bombing mission over Tunis in North Africa. The formation had completed the bombing and was returning to base when it was intercepted by German fighters. A Messerschmitt Bf 109, in a desperate maneuver, collided directly with the tail of the All-American. The impact was devastating. The German fighter literally cut the B-17's fuselage almost in half. The rear section of the aircraft, including the tail, stabilizers, and part of the fuselage, was left hanging by a few control cables and a thin layer of aluminum. Any aeronautical engineer would say the aircraft should have broken in two instantly. The structure was compromised beyond any safety margin. The control cables were exposed. The tail was literally swinging in the wind. But Lieutenant Bragg didn't give up. With supernatural calm, he assessed the situation. The engine still worked. The wings were intact. The controls responded poorly, but they responded. The aircraft was still flying. Bragg made a decision that would go down in history. He was going to try to bring that wreck back home. The return flight was an exercise in impossible piloting. Any sudden maneuver could break the aircraft in half. Any turbulence could be fatal. Bragg flew with surgical smoothness, making millimetric corrections, keeping the aircraft as stable as possible. The crew in the rear section, the tail gunner and radio operator, were isolated, separated from the rest of the aircraft by an abyss of twisted metal and open sky. They couldn't move forward without risking the tail coming off completely. For 2 hours, the All-American crawled through the Mediterranean sky. Other bombers in the formation flew alongside, documenting the impossible, taking the photographs that would become legendary. When Bragg finally spotted the base at Biskra, Algeria, he faced another problem: landing. Without the rear structure intact, any hard impact could destroy the aircraft. The landing gear might not hold. The tail could come off at the moment of touchdown. Bragg executed the smoothest landing of his career. The All-American touched the runway like a feather, rolled to a stop, and only then did the tail finally give way, falling to the side. All 10 crew members survived. The photograph of the All-American, showing an aircraft literally cut in half, but still intact enough to fly, became one of the most powerful symbols of American resilience during the war. August 17, 1943, a date that would become known as Black Thursday in the annals of the 8th Air Force. The target, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt facilities at Regensburg, both in the heart of Germany. Ball bearings were critical components for virtually all German war machinery. Destroying them could paralyze Nazi military production. The problem: to get there, the bombers would have to fly hundreds of miles over enemy territory without fighter escort. The American P-47 Thunderbolts didn't have enough range to accompany the formation to the target. The bombers would be alone. 376 B-17s took off that morning. What followed was one of the bloodiest days of the air war. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had. Hundreds of fighters intercepted the American formations in successive waves. The attacks were coordinated, brutal, relentless. Fighters dove head-on, firing 20mm cannons directly at cockpits. Others attacked from below, aiming at fuel tanks. Some German pilots, out of ammunition, tried to ram the bombers. The anti-aircraft fire over the targets was the most intense the Americans had ever faced. The sky over Schweinfurt transformed into a solid wall of explosions. 60 B-17s were shot down that day. 600 crew members killed or captured. Dozens of other aircraft returned so damaged they would never fly again. But among the wreckage and carnage, stories of impossible heroism emerged. The B-17 Memphis Belle, which would later become the first bomber to complete 25 missions and return home, survived that day with more than 200 shrapnel holes in its fuselage. Another B-17, whose name was lost to history, returned to base with only one engine working, the other 3 destroyed or on fire. The pilot, a 22-year-old lieutenant, kept the aircraft in the air by sheer willpower, gliding long distances to save the fuel that was leaking from punctured tanks. A third bomber landed with the pilot dead at the controls. The co-pilot, wounded in the arm and leg, took command and brought the aircraft back, operating controls with one hand, while bleeding profusely. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission was a tactical disaster. The factories were only partially damaged and returned to production within weeks. But it demonstrated something the Germans didn't expect. The Americans weren't going to stop. It didn't matter how many aircraft fell, how many men died. They would come back. They would always come back. November 1943. A B-17 from the 379th Bombardment Group was returning from a mission over Bremen when it was hit by anti-aircraft fire that completely destroyed the navigation and communication systems. The pilot, Lieutenant Charles Brown, was wounded. The co-pilot was dead. The navigator was incapacitated. Of the 10 crew members, only 5 were still in condition to function. The aircraft was lost, literally. Without navigation instruments, without radio, flying over enemy territory with limited fuel and severe structural damage. And then, something extraordinary happened. A German Bf-109 fighter approached the destroyed B-17. The American pilot prepared for the final blow, but the fighter didn't shoot. Instead, the German pilot, who would later be identified as Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace, flew alongside the American bomber. He gestured, pointed directions. He escorted the damaged B-17 to the North Sea, out of German airspace, and then waved and departed. Franz Stigler had chosen not to kill. Years later, in 1990, Charles Brown managed to track down Stigler, who had emigrated to Canada after the war. The two men met, embraced, and remained friends until death, passing away within months of each other in 2008. Stigler explained his decision. "I saw those wounded men through the holes in the fuselage. I saw they had no chance. Shooting them would be murder, not war. I simply couldn't do it." This story was documented in the book A Higher Call and represents one of the most humanizing moments of a war marked by industrial brutality. August 1st, 1943. Operation Tidal Wave. The target: the oil fields and refineries of Ploiești, Romania, responsible for 1/3 of all fuel for the Nazi war machine. This would be the most ambitious and most disastrous low-altitude bombing mission of the war. 177B, 24 Liberator bombers took off from bases in Libya for a journey of more than 1,200 miles. The plan was audacious. Instead of bombing from high altitude, the B-24s would fly at less than 300 feet above the ground, below the range of German radar, and attack the refineries with surgical precision. Everything went wrong. Navigation errors split the formation. Some groups arrived at the wrong targets. Others arrived too early, losing the element of surprise. When the bombers finally attacked, the Germans were waiting. What followed was a massacre. The B-24s flew so low that German anti-aircraft machine guns fired horizontally, not upward. Enemy fighters dove on the bombers, which had no room to maneuver. Explosions at the refineries created columns of fire that the aircraft had to fly through. One B-24, hit by anti-aircraft fire, continued flying in flames for several miles before finally crashing. The crew remained at their positions, firing at ground targets until the last moment. Another bomber, with the landing gear destroyed and half the wing on fire, completed its bombing run, dropped its bombs with precision on the designated target, and then tried to gain altitude so the crew could bail out. The pilot kept the aircraft stable, while his men jumped, one by one, before finally losing control. Lieutenant Lloyd Hughes was piloting a B-24 that was hit in the fuel tanks during the approach. Aviation gasoline leaked from the wings, leaving a flammable trail behind the aircraft. Hughes knew that any spark, any trace around, would transform his bomber into a fireball. He completed the mission anyway. Hughes flew his leaking B-24 directly over the target, dropped his bombs, and only then tried to escape. An explosion on the ground ignited the fuel trail. The flames reached the aircraft. Hughes fought to maintain control, while fire consumed the plane, trying to give his crew time to escape. The B-24 crashed seconds later. Hughes and most of his crew died. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Of 177 bombers that departed for Ploiești, 54 were lost. More than 500 crew members died. Another 200 were captured. It was the mission with the highest number of casualties in a single day in the history of the American Air Force. 5 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions that day, the highest number for a single air operation in history. December 1943. The B-17-year-old Pub, piloted by Lieutenant Charlie Brown, not to be confused with the Charles Brown mentioned earlier, was participating in its first combat mission over Bremen. The mission was a disaster from the start. Ye Old Pub was hit repeatedly by anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks. The nose of the aircraft was partially destroyed. The oxygen system failed. Several crew members were wounded. One engine was destroyed, another was failing. Brown was hit in the shoulder by shrapnel. Blood loss and lack of oxygen caused him to lose consciousness briefly. When he woke up, the aircraft was in an uncontrolled dive, just a few thousand feet from the ground. With superhuman effort, Brown regained control of the bomber. But the situation was desperate. The aircraft was destroyed, the crew wounded, and they were still over Germany. That's when Franz Stigler appeared. The German ace, veteran of dozens of combats, approached the destroyed B-17 to deliver the coup de grace. But when he saw the extent of the damage, the holes in the fuselage, the wounded crew members visible through the torn metal, the blood on the windows, he hesitated. Stigler remembered the words of his commander. "If I see or find out that you shot a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." For Stigler, shooting that B-17 would be the moral equivalent of shooting men in parachutes. They had no chance. Instead of shooting, Stigler flew alongside the American bomber. He tried to signal for Brown to land in Germany and surrender. At least that way the crew would survive. Brown didn't understand, or chose not to understand. Then Stigler did something unbelievable. He escorted the B-17 out of German airspace, protecting it from coastal anti-aircraft batteries by flying alongside the bomber. The German gunners on the ground wouldn't fire with one of their own fighters so close. When they reached the North Sea, Stigler waved to Brown and turned back toward Germany. The old pub managed to reach England. Brown and most of his crew survived. Stigler never told anyone what he had done. Reporting the incident would mean court-martial and execution for treason. He carried the secret for decades. 46 years later, in 1990, Brown finally found Stigler through a search that lasted years. The two men became close friends, a friendship that lasted until their deaths in 2008. This story is different from the others. It's not about an aircraft that completed an impossible mission. It's about an aircraft that disappeared and the mystery that remained for 15 years. April 4th, 1943. The B-24D Lady Be Good took off from a base in Libya for a bombing mission over Naples, Italy. It was the crew's first combat mission. The Lady Be Good never reached the target, and it never returned to base. The aircraft simply disappeared. No radio signal. No wreckage found. No survivors. The crew of 9 men was declared missing in action. For 15 years, the fate of the Lady Be Good remained a mystery. In 1958, an oil prospecting team flying over the Libyan desert spotted something strange. An intact aircraft landed in the middle of nowhere, more than 400 miles south of any known flight route. It was the Lady Be Good. The aircraft was in surprisingly good condition. The desert had preserved the plane almost perfectly. The tank still contained fuel. The radio still worked. The canteen still had water. But there were no bodies. The investigation that followed revealed a tragic story. On the night of the mission, the Lady Be Good had gotten lost. Navigation problems, possibly caused by unexpected winds or calculation errors, took the aircraft far beyond the target and the base. By the time the crew realized they were lost, it was too late. With fuel running out, the pilot attempted an emergency landing in the desert. But in the darkness, he didn't realize he was much higher than he thought. The crew bailed out with parachutes, expecting to land near the aircraft. The Lady Be Good, now with no one at the controls, continued flying, without the weight of the crew and with the engines at idle. The aircraft glided for more than 16 miles before finally landing softly in the desert, an almost perfect ghost landing. The crew landed by parachute miles away. They regrouped. 8 of the 9 men managed to find each other and began walking north toward the coast, toward salvation. They never made it. The bodies were found over the following years, scattered across the desert. The recovered diaries tell a story of growing despair, thirst, exhaustion, hallucinations. The last survivor walked more than 80 miles before finally succumbing. The Lady Be Good remains one of the most studied mysteries in military aviation. How did an aircraft land by itself, almost perfectly, in the middle of the desert? Why couldn't the crew find the plane? What exactly went wrong that night? Some questions will never have answers. After all these stories, you might be wondering, how is this possible? How could aircraft so damaged continue flying? The answer lies in a combination of brilliant engineering, favorable physics, and pure luck. First, the engineering. The B-17 was designed with absurd safety margins for its time. The wings were built with multiple spars, structural beams that distributed the load. If one spar was destroyed, the others could still support the weight. The fuselage was semi-monocoque, which means the skin of the aircraft itself contributed to structural integrity. Even with large holes, the remaining structure could keep the aircraft together. Second, redundancy. The B-17 had 4 engines. It could fly poorly, but fly, with only one working. The control systems had duplicate cables. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, with a rubber layer that expanded when punctured, closing small holes. Third, physics. An aircraft in flight has an enormous amount of kinetic energy. Even severely damaged, that energy doesn't disappear instantly. A skilled pilot could use that energy to keep the aircraft in the air long enough to reach friendly territory. And finally, the human factor. The pilots and crews of these bombers were trained for extreme situations. They knew their aircraft intimately. They knew exactly how much abuse a machine could withstand. And when the situation demanded it, they found reserves of courage and skill they didn't even know they had. It's easy to get lost in the stories of heroism and survival, but we need to remember the cost. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe cost more than 47,000 American lives. More than 26,000 aircraft were lost. Thousands of young men, most under 25 years old, never came home. And on the other side, the cost was even greater. Allied bombing killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, names that became synonymous with destruction. The air war was brutal, impersonal, and devastating. The men who flew these bombers knew they were causing death and destruction on an industrial scale. Many carried that weight for the rest of their lives. The stories of miraculous survival are inspiring, but they exist in the context of almost incomprehensible horror. For every aircraft that returned destroyed but intact, dozens fell in flames. For every crew that survived against all odds, hundreds weren't so lucky. What can we learn from these stories, almost 80 years later? First, the importance of robust engineering. Modern aircraft are incredibly safe in part because engineers learned from B-17s and B-24s of World War II. Redundancy, safety margins, backup systems, these concepts were refined in the fire of war. Second, the power of human determination. In impossible situations, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary feats. The pilots and crews in these stories weren't superheroes. They were normal young men, placed in abnormal circumstances, who found within themselves the strength to survive. Third, the moral complexity of war. Franz Stigler chose not to kill. That decision, small in the context of the war, saved lives and created a friendship that lasted decades. Even in the midst of brutality, humanity can prevail. And finally, the importance of remembering. These stories should not be forgotten. Not because they glorify war, they don't, but because they remind us of what ordinary people are capable of, both good and bad. We return to the beginning. A destroyed aircraft, an impossible mission, men who refuse to die. The stories we told today are just a fraction of the thousands that happened during World War II. Every B-17 that returned home with impossible damage had a crew with their own stories, their own fears, their own hopes. Many of these men never spoke about what they lived through. They returned home, built families, lived normal lives. They carried their memories in silence, sometimes for decades. Others, like Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler, found a form of reconciliation. They transformed the horror of war into something different, an unlikely friendship, a story of humanity amid inhumanity. And some, like Alan McGee, became living legends, survivors of impossible falls, witnesses to miracles that science can barely explain. What unites all these stories is something profoundly human: the refusal to give up. When all odds said it was impossible, when logic said to accept the inevitable, these men chose to fight. They chose to fly. They chose to live. And that's why their stories still resonate, almost a century later, because they remind us that even in the most desperate situations, there's always a chance. There's always hope. Even in a destroyed aircraft, barely able to fly, thousands of feet over enemy territory. Especially then, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. These stories took weeks of research, and I hope they were as impactful for you as they were for me. If you want to know more about any of these specific stories, leave it in the comments. I can make dedicated episodes for each of them with even more details. And if you know other stories of impossible missions completed with destroyed aircraft, share them too. World War II is full of stories like these, waiting to be told. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. That really helps the algorithm show the video to more people.